CHERYL for presiding. Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Pursuing the matter of PC-2021-05915 versus Southwell versus McKee.
All right, we're continuing with the direct examination of Dr. McDonald.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, if you come back up, please.
And for the record, the defense has pre-marked exhibit V as in Victor for identification. Your Honor, exhibit has been selected. Looks like to remind the witness that having previously been sworn in, you are still under oath. You could just state your name for the record, please.
I am Dr. Jim McDonald.
Thank you. Your Honor, before we begin this as a procedural matter, plaintiff's counsel and I have agreed to enter exhibit U without objection, which is with respect to Executive Order 2197, continuing, which continues the prior executive order from August 19th. So I ask that that's marked in full.
My agreement to you is
But it's useful.
Your Honor, additionally, plaintiff's counsel and I have spoken with respect to exhibit B, which is pre-marked, which is Dr. McDonald's resume.
Oh.
No objection.
V is in Victor is full.
Says V full.
Doctor, you've been made what's been marked in full. This is exhibit B, which is a current copy of your resume. Do you have it in front of you, Doctor?
I do.
Doctor, looking at your resume that's before you, is there any materials related to the COVID-19 pandemic that's not listed on your current resume?
Yeah, the only thing missing is I did have a publication in the American Journal of Public Health early in the pandemic with Dr. Chan and some others on the seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2. It was a surveillance study. But other than that, it looks accurate.
Doctor, what was the title of that study?
It was seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2 in various populations of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Doctor.
Your Honor, just a couple of studies here.
Is it not one of your records that has this one down? This is not this. You might want to put it on.
So exhibit W for identification.
For identification, yes, thank you.
So you just hand it to the witness.
Yes, please, what number is that?
W.
70?
W.
W.
Welcome.
That's correct.
I'm sorry, that one you just gave me, one you marked?
Yes, they're two separate.
I'm sorry, the copy that you just gave me, was that for the judge?
That's it. It will be eventually, but it's a separate study. So if you gave him one that is not what the doctor has in front of him.
So this is X?
That is X, correct.
President X for identification. Do you have a W, please, Judge?
Great, W next. Doctor, you can hand a document that is pre-marked as, not pre-marked, but it's marked as
publication from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, published September 10th, 2021. It's titled Trends in COVID-19 Cases, Emergency Department Visits and Hospital Admissions Among Children and Adolescents 0 to 17 from August of 2020 to August of 2021.
Sir, how do you recognize the document that's in front of you?
Well, I read this before. This is a periodical I subscribe to electronically, so it comes to my email.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, is this document, is that relevant to your current role as the Rhode Island Department of Health?
Yes?
Doctor, do you rely on this document in your current role as the Rhode Island Department of Health?
Yes?
And are asked if the document be marked in full?
No objection.
Doctor,
That'd be useful.
useful. Doctor, you testified that you relied in part on exhibit W medicine before you. Can you please explain what information in exhibit W you relied on in your role as Rhode Island Department of Health, specifically in the COVID-19 unit?
Yeah, so this is a study that just looks at what you've seen with COVID in children over the last year. It was relevant because of the time frame. It's so recent, but includes the last year. Part of what piqued my interest was figure 1.
Doctor, pages out on this book.
Figure 1 on the 3rd page here. It says page 1251 on the bottom.
Thank you.
So what you see in figure 1 is it just talks about cases per 100,000 persons, and it does it from August of 2020 to August of 2021. And what was interesting is since it's a national study, you see in July, there's the same dip that we were seeing in Rhode Island. But after July, you see in different age groups, whether it's children 0 to 4 years old, 5 to 11 years old, or 12 to 17-year-olds, that it really goes up quite steeply through August. So that was something that was, interesting to me and certainly made sense of things we were seeing in Rhode Island. The other thing that was kind of interesting was just the content of the data in figure 2. That looks at hospitalizations. So figure 1 looked at cases, but figure 2 looks at children who ended up in the hospital by age group, but it also includes how many end up in the intensive care unit, and then how many end up on a ventilator. And it just shows the numbers over time, and you see a similar trend is it really dips in June of 2021, but yet it starts to go up in July and August. And it doesn't include a full month of August because they stopped at August 21st. But it does seem, the same trend we've seen here as well in Rhode Island. So, what they concluded was, severe illness in children isn't common, but it still occurs. And they looked at emergency departments, hospitalizations, and they saw increases, which really coincides with the Delta variant being dominant. So they talked about why it was important to do preventive measures to protect people from acquiring COVID. And that was the point. Not everybody can be vaccinated, so the other preventive measures that we talked about yesterday were all the more important.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, you could put that exhibit, unless there's something else to say about it, you could put that down. And now direct your attention to the exhibit that's marked as exhibit X. Do you have that, Doctor?
I do.
Doctor, what is this document before you?
So this is a publication from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. It was published the same day, September 10th, 2021. It's titled Hospitalizations Associated with COVID-19 Among Children and Adolescents, COVID-NET, 14 states, March 1st, 2020 through August 14th, 2021.
Doctor, how do you recognize this document?
So it came in the same email that I got from the other episode. In other words, I subscribed to this periodical, so it came on email, so I read it.
Doctor, why is the information in this document relevant to your current position as Rhode Island Department of Health and COVID unit?
It is.
Doctor, why is the information in this article relevant to your current role as COVID unit at Rhode Island Department of Health?
Well, they looked at these 14 states throughout the entire pandemic, and so there's trends that can be gleaned from there. And there are samples from all over the country, but it's relevant because it really talks about how the pandemic is acting. When you look at figure 1 in particular, it tells an interesting story.
Doctor, 1 second.
Figure 1 is on page 1257, or the third page of this document. So, figure 1 just illustrates hospitalizations for 100,000 children and adolescents.
He's reading from a document of identification.
Yes. Your Honor, I asked this document to be in full, as Dr. McDonald testified that providing this information in the enrollment COVID-19 unit.
Just to clarify, he relies upon it for advising the governor on executive order in the year two, or is it just, he just looks at it and it just informs his decision on the that's what I'm saying.
It informs his decisions in general with respect to any guidance he would give to the governor based upon updated information.
Access full.
Text full.
Dr. Natalie uses it in full, please go on.
So figure 1 tells an interesting story. It looks at hospitalizations for 100,000 children and adolescents, and it's cumulative hospitalizations for 100,000 by age group. And it just shows over time, no matter what age group you're looking at, it keeps going up. What it indicates is, it's just heading in a direction where it's still an active pandemic. Figure 2, which I think is even more interesting.
And Dr., what page is that on, please?
Figure 2 is on page 1258,
Thank you, Doctor.
or the fourth page, what's in front of you. So that actually shows hospitalizations for 100,000 children and adolescents, and it starts from the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020 through August of 2021. And you see the rates peak and dip, peak and deep, and it peaked in December of 2020, and then it started to trend down again, went up again in May, and then it came down again in June, and then it sort of echoes what's going on now, it's going up again. And one of the things you really see about the pandemic is it's a new disease. We're still learning about it, but it seems to peak and then go down a little bit, peak and go down a little bit, but you really can't see that it's actually stopping just yet. So I thought it was informative to me and interesting here. When you look at what the authors did in this study was, they admitted that we don't see a lot of severe cases in children and adolescents, but we do see some, and tracking hospitalization rates is something we should be keeping our eye on. One of the things they noticed was how it's really increasing between June of 21 and August of 21. One of the conclusions they draw here is they said, I'm just going to read from here, please.
Doctor, can you please identify what page you're on and what paragraph?
I'm on page 1259. I'm just going to read a sentence from the summary because I just thought it was informative. It said the proportions of hospitalized children and adolescents.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you need to pause for 1 second, Doctor. Can you
Okay.
please tell us what paragraph you're in?
So I'm in the blue box in the upper right-hand corner that's called summary. I'm reading from the second sentence of the right below where it says, what is added by this report?
Thank you, Doctor.
It just says the proportions of hospitalized children and adolescents with severe disease were similar before and during the period of Delta predominance. The hospitalization rates were 10 times higher among unvaccinated than among fully vaccinated adolescents. Then they go on to talk about how preventive measures to reduce transmission and severe outcomes in children and adolescents are critical, including vaccination, universal masking in schools, and masking of persons older than 2 in other outdoor public spaces and child care centers. So it was informative to us. It just was consistent with previous studies, but it's the type of thing that you'd like to see is consistency. How is the pandemic still acting?
Thank you, Doctor. Your Honor, before I have more exhibits marked at this point in time, I want to advise the court and opposing counsel that the state is now looking to introduce information with respect to the October data dashboards. The reason to present to the doctor, we focused primarily on August and September, with a little bit on June, but we're now moving into October. I just want to inform the court that in case there's an objection with respect to that, before I go ahead and on things.
Well, the court has a concern, even though you're being thorough, and I understand your desire to be thorough. This order was put into effect well before October, correct?
Yes, Your Honor, but one of the prongs that needs to be established with respect to issuing an injunction is what decision about the status quo, and whether or not the status quo will be effective moving forward.
Mr. Petrilli?
Yes, sir. First of all, I think status quo applies to TROs, not preliminary injunctions, but even if it apply.
No, it applies, but I thought it was not the current status quo, but
Yes.
the injunction's effect on the status, the action's effect on the status quo.
Yeah.
Whether the injunction would affect the status quo.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Can you say that one more time? The status quo, Your Honor, is wearing masks, so those two are clear. Correct?
No,
Okay.
I disagree.
The status quo for the last 2 months, or I guess 40-something days, has been to wear masks. But one of the issues is the imminent harm of removing masks and granting or denying plaintiff's motion. So in order to make a calculated decision with respect to that, it's the state's position that October numbers are relevant to that.
Counsel?
Actually, I think the status quo was not very massive. As of June 29th, the state governor, the Department of Education, the Department of Health all indicated that masks would be an option in the upcoming school year. That was the status quo on August 19th. The executive order changed the status quo. So the issue with regard to maintaining the status quo would be to go back to what the situation was on August 18th, which was that masks were optional.
Yours?
That-
I apologize, right?
That's, so if we're gonna argue status quo, that's the status quo.
Your Honor, we can get into status quo down the road, I understand that, but it's actually status quo as to when that lawsuit is filed. And so the status quo as to when the lawsuit was filed was a masking mandate that David Phil said.
The only reason the lawsuit was filed is because of the executive order. There would be no reason to file a lawsuit until the emergency order came into effect and changed the status quo.
It's still, Your Honor, going to.
So, Mr. Petrilli, you acknowledge that the issuance of preliminary injunction will preserve the status quo?
Our position would be that whether it's a TRO or preliminary injunction, if it was issued, it would revert to the status quo prior to the issuance of the executive order, which was no masking or option masking.
One of the, obviously there's slight variations of when the Supreme Court considers injunctions and the elements for it. But the Foster Gloucester Regional School Committee case from 2010 indicates that the court need consider whether the issuance of a preliminary injunction will preserve the status quo. So if the status quo is students have masks, then the injunction would preserve the status quo. But actually, another case that
I should know that case. It was probably my case, Your Honor. I just can't remember.
there's actually another case that says status quo ante and defines that a little better, which I don't have in front of me.
And I think that would have been a D's case, which was a lease that was going to be, I think that the D's case was, it was a lease, they tried to break the lease, and the court said the status quo ante was the lease stayed in effect prior to them breaking the lease, leading to the request for the TRO.
Your Honor, I just have one more thing.
Sure.
Putting aside the status quo, the key issue is still irreparable harm. And what harm will be done if the mask mandate, whether it's lifted, whether it stays, where we are currently in the pandemic, matters in making that determination. That goes to be irreparable harm.
So I remember the Foster Gloucester case. It had to do with the building committee. And they tried to remove a member of the building committee. The status quo ante was letting the person remain on the building committee before he was removed. I remember that case. That was Judge Silverstein.
This question was whether or not X is full. Am I correct?
No, Your Honor. I was presenting an offer of proof to let the court know where I was going next.
Oh, yes.
In anticipation of an objection from plaintiff, so I didn't want to go through that whole process.
Okay.
Well, it was the court's concern. I don't think the plaintiff. It's the court's concerned because what we really have to look at is what the situation is going to be, I suppose, on the date of decision, if you look at it that way. So this is a moving case. But let me defer to the plaintiff to find out what their objection is. Well, we also want to get to a decision at some point, I suppose.
I agree, Your Honor. I imagine the data may be relevant because the executive order is up for renewal in 2 days. If you're going to be relying upon that and giving these recommendations to the governor in 2 days as to whether to extend this executive order or to end it, then it might be relevant. But we don't know what this witness is going to be recommending to the governor in 2 days. And of course, the emergency rule continues at least for 45 days, which I think brings it to the middle of November. Although in the order, there's also a reference to January 20th of 2022, so I'm not quite sure how long the emergency rule was intended to be in effect.
You're saying this order is dependent on an executive order which expires in 2 days?
Potentially, yeah. We don't know. You know, I'm sure the witness is prepared to make a recommendation to the governor. He says the governor listens to him, so whatever he tells the governor is probably what's going to happen.
Well, governor, so I won't go that far.
Your Honor, even if you get rid of the executive order, you still have the Rhode Island Department of Health regulation that's still in effect. And
It's not dependent on the executive order?
the regulation is separate and apart for a set period of time, for a period of time. And so the state's position, it all comes back to irreparable harm. They're focused on irreparable harm, and I don't want to speak for Greg, but with respect to the 35 plaintiffs and their children. We're focused, the state's focused on irreparable harm to the rest of the state. And that's why these numbers matter.
Just nothing. If you don't want to,
I'm inclined just to allow it to see where this goes. There's no jury here, we will be precious.
Part of the problem in this case, Judge, is Exhibit U is the extension of the original executive order. It says nothing. It gives no basis for continuing the executive. All it says is, I continue the executive order.
I get your concerns
And
about
if that's going to happen again in October, in 2 days, what's the, if it's going to say we rely on this data dashboard information, maybe I shouldn't tip off the state as to how they should write the new executive order. But they didn't write this one very well. The second one.
but the state is saying that the masking requirement is not dependent upon the executive order. So,
Is that stipulated?
That's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying there's two prongs. You have the executive order that was put in on 8/19, then the extension of that executive order, which is Exhibit U, and then we also have the Rhode Island Department of Health regulation that was on September 23rd. So there's multiple prongs here.
okay, so if it's not dependent on renewal of the executive order, then this whole case may be mooted in 2 days,
Because you still have the Rhode Island Department of Health regulation.
which you're now saying is not dependent upon the executive order.
Is that what I'm saying? Yeah, that is what I'm saying.
But you just said that it was.
Well, they're all kind of sort of intertwined, Your Honor.
I know, but maybe we should wait till the other side of this to see what the law will be at the time the decision is written. Your briefs aren't even in for this change.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I missed that.
If there's a change, if there's renewal of the executive order, or if the status quo will then be without an executive order. Could be, or it could be with a new executive order. We are, the case really isn't right yet.
The October data?
No, we don't know what law will apply. We don't know what regulation will be applying to this case.
I don't know what's going to happen in 2 days, Your Honor. That's the question.
I know, none of us do. But I don't know why we should spend the rest of the afternoon shooting in the dark. Clearly, you've all put a lot of time into this, I have no question about that. And clearly, if there's harm going on to school children, it's continuing to go on every day, I get that. But I'm not going to be able to determine this case in 2 days before the governor either takes action or doesn't take action. showing a new dashboard or whatever other proof you have concerning what's going on right now, what may go on in the next week or so, which I think is where you're about to go. That's going to show that there is additional harm.
It's going to show that the harm is still ongoing, that the numbers are not what they were back in June, when we kind of started thought we were at the tail end of things.
That sounds to me like they're going to do the work.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
That sounds to me like they're going to do the executive order. Otherwise, why would they be putting this in right now?
I want to be clear, I have not had any conversations with the governor's office. I am just using these documents to show that there's ongoing irreparable harm.
Is your client, what do you mean that? I'm sorry, Judge.
About this
I
specific
apologize.
issue.
Apologize for the comment.
If you want to go there now, I'll allow for what it's worth, but reserve to Mr. Fisherly the right to object to each individual question. Well, I guess you're making an offer of proof, but I don't know what you're going to offer. I don't know what's coming, so.
I can tell the board, it's the same data sheets that were
You
introduced.
probably got to want to object as it comes up anyway.
Okay. That's
I
fine.
mean, we could argue it out for a while, but I don't know if it's doing anything.
Judge, just timing-wise, I mean, okay. When do I do my cross-examination? We've been, this is getting dragged on for quite a while here. At some point, there's going to be an end to this direct examination, and I should have an opportunity to present my case. And it's getting dragged on. This is day 3, I believe, of this witness. It's been, I mean, if I had to guess, about 8 hours of this testimony so far. When does this enough is enough on the state stays here?
I think they're serious in their defense.
Just to mark that for ID. And I can write you over that. Next.
Next is Y.
Why?
Y, press Y for identification. You have a couple.
Thank you. Okay, Doctor. Doctor, what you have before you has been marked as Exhibit Y. Can you please identify the document that is before you?
It's the October 4th, 2021 COVID data dashboard.
Are there any other documents associated with this set?
There's a tab for October 7th, and then there's a tab for October 12th. And they're all of the COVID data dashboard excerpts that we went over in similar fashion yesterday.
So Doctor, are these excerpts the same pages that were introduced yesterday with the data dashboards for September and August?
Yes, they're the same ones.
And Doctor, how do you recognize the data dashboards that are before you?
These are emailed to me twice a week.
And Doctor, is
So by Monday, I'm sorry, next Tuesday, we'll have another one, right? You will have one.
I will.
I actually think it might come out today, too. Doctor, when you enroll at the Rhode Island Department of Health, do you rely on the data dashboards to help formulate your opinions with respect to the ongoing pandemic?
Yes.
Doctor, can you, without looking at these, can you testify why the information in the data dashboards are relevant to you in your current role in the excerpts that are provided?
So we look at number of cases per day, number of admissions. I look at how the hospitals are doing as far as whether they're overcrowded or not. I look at how many monoclonal antibody treatments have been given out. And it gives me an idea of where we are with vaccinations as well. I follow hospitalization data. So it gives me a big picture of the entire pandemic. That's why it's a useful document for me.
Your Honor, at this point in time, I asked that Exhibit Y be moved in full.
Why is full?
Doctor, I'm just going to focus your attention to the last data dashboard that is here, the October 12th. Doctor, looking at the October 12th data dashboard, you previously testified that the first page of this dashboard was reviews. I want to direct your attention, please, to the second page, hospital details. Doctor, in your role at the Rhode Island Department of Health and as the director of the COVID unit, can you please explain why the information on the hospital details page is relevant to you in your current position?
Yes.
Why, Doctor?
Well, I look at the National Emergency Department overcrowding scores, and it just shows how our 10 acute care hospitals are doing right now. They report this data twice a day, so it comes up with a number. So I like to see how many of the hospitals are in the dangerously and severely overcrowded scores, because that speaks to how likely they're going to have to monitor diversion and not be able to care for the patients that are presenting to the emergency room either by ambulance or by walking into the emergency room.
Doctor, based upon the NEOC score that is on this page, how many hospitals in the state of Rhode Island as of October 11, 2021 are at dangerously overcrowded or severely overcrowded in the state of Rhode Island?
7.
And that's at how many hospitals, Doctor?
We have 10 acute care hospitals.
Doctor, I want to direct your attention to the next page of the data dashboard, same day. Doctor, what's the title of this page, please? What's the title, please, Doctor?
Hospital overcrowding.
Doctor, can you please tell me whether or not this information is relevant to your current role at the Rhode Island Department of Health?
Yes.
Can you please explain why this information is relevant to you in your current role at the Rhode Island Department of Health?
Because it tells me a trend of how the hospital's been doing over the last several weeks when it comes to their scores. So it's a different way of looking at the same data on the page before.
Thank you, Doctor. And finally, Doctor, I want to direct your attention to the last page, cases by age group. Now, we've seen this exhibit before with respect to other dates. Doctor, looking at this particular page, can you please explain what information this provides with respect to your current role in the COVID-19 unit at the Rhode Island Department of Health?
Is there new information on that, Doctor, which is not contained in the prior report?
Excuse me, Doctor.
Is there new information on that page which is not contained in the prior report?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what is that?
In the box in the upper left-hand corner,
That goes to October 2, right?
right here, top 5 weekly.
To October 2. Right?
September 26th, October 2. Right.
Wasn't that in the previous reports that you talked about?
It did, the previous report, Your Honor, stopped on September, right before September 23rd, and I don't remember the
I
date.
did ask the witness, but I'll let it go.
It is the same. It is the same. I'm not sure why it's the way. You're right, it's the same.
It's the same information previously testified to?
I didn't previously testify to the state ratings, but Judge Lander is correct. I'm not sure why it's there, but it's the same data that's in the October 2nd. But I haven't testified to it before.
So briefly,
If
Your
I could
Honor,
add something just for the clarification of counsel, because I know that Mr. Pitcherly is concerned about his right to cross-examine, and that's not only a concern, it's a priority for the board, that has to be done. And I thought about that in this case and how to handle it. And let me just, I know Dr. McDonald's time is valuable, but the right of cross-examination is paramount. So this is a problem that the court gets a lot, and we got it a lot. We tried to figure out how to handle it when handling medical malpractice cases for the first few times. Because an expert witness flies in on a plane, comes to the court in the morning, and hopes to get out that evening to go home. The problem is, the party who's calling him keeps him on the stand, him or her on the stand for a while. So what I did in the past is I make it very clear to counsel pre-trial that if the direct examination of the expert is not concluded by noon, assume that that doctor is going to stay in the state for another day or be called back, and you're going to pay for it, even though it's cross-examination. If we were to apply the same limit here, that would give Mr. Fisher at least some, I thought it was 4 days, he says 3. That would give Mr. Fisher at least some time. So I understand his concern, but with almost every question, he has a right to cross-examine. I'll leave it at that.
May I go on? With that caveat. Your Honor,
In case you didn't get it, brevity is always appreciated.
Your Honor, if I
Yes.
have 2 minutes left, maybe 3.
And then when you get to the late afternoon, then the person calling you wants to do a rebuttal.
That might have to.
Yeah, I think so. I think he has to get back to the Department of Health at some point, but go ahead.
All right, Doctor. Focusing on the data update on cases by age group with respect to October 6th, we're looking at the 10-12 document. It should be the last page of the set that you have in front of you.
How do you?
Okay, Doctor, thank you. Looking at this document, does this fit? You've already testified that the data dashboard helps to formulate your opinion with respect to the COVID-19.
Didn't we cover all the questions on that last week? I mean, that was
We did not.
updated. That's the same chart as of,
The charts are always the same, Your Honor. The information itself is updated. So we have not talked about anything with respect to October. But it could quite possibly be the
you
September
may get to
26th
the end of
data.
this quicker if I just.
Your Honor, it is the September 26th data, if that's where you're going. So yes, that's been talked about. That's the most recent one.
Thank you.
And with that, Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you.
I could just need to clean up, please.
You have X for ID?
One moment, Your Honor, just need to look at my notes. X is full, Your Honor.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you see what's there, please? Thank you, appreciate it.
Mr. Fisher. Thank you.
Dr. McDonald, have you ever been, designed, funded, or had funded, completed or published results of a randomized controlled trial?
No.
Have you ever designed and funded to implement, completed or published results of a prospective cohort study?
You know, I've done so many, I don't think I've done a perspective course, so no.
Have you ever designed, funded, implemented, completed, and published results of a retrospective case? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, could you just start over?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Doctor, have you ever designed, then been funded and implemented, and then completed and published the results of a retrospective case control study?
Just so I can change the question if I could. Are you asking if I've done all of those things or any of those things? Because I've never funded any study.
Okay. Have you ever designed a retrospective case control study?
There was an or in there, right, Mr. Fisher? When we went through that list, there was an or,
Right. There was.
any of those.
Okay, yeah, so, yeah, I've done those.
In a retrospective case control study?
Yes, there's some on my resume. We just did one recently on deaths from overdoses
Okay, and did you design the study?
with my team, sure, yeah.
You have it funded to implement it?
We did the study, it's published.
And it was on. And you're saying that was a opioid deaths?
Yes, we looked at people who are on methadone or buprenorphine and what their outcomes were.
Doctor, we spent some time talking about randomized control trials. And you testified that, in your opinion, randomized control trials with regard to children and masking them would somehow be improper or unethical. Is that correct?
I did.
Okay. And you said, you testified that you are on what's called an institutional review board?
I did, yeah.
Okay. And that's at Rhode Island Hospital, correct?
No, I'm on
I mean, Rhode Island Department of Health.
the, yes, sir.
Institutional review boards are at almost every medical facility or institution, is that correct?
Yes, there, any facility that does research, they're not unique to medicine.
So there's not just one institutional review board in the state of Rhode Island?
That's correct.
All the hospitals have them, is that correct?
I would assume so, I don't know for sure.
Brown Medical probably has one?
Anyone that does research would have one?
Okay. And then there's all over the country, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And there's standards for them, right?
yes,
There's federal standards, right?
yes, there's federal standards.
Do you know what those standards are?
Well, they're in the city training. If you take the city training, which is the training you have to take to do a study, they talk about the standards that you have for human subjects protection.
City training?
CITI is what it's called.
Okay, what's CITI stand?
It's an acronym for the name of the training. I don't really remember what the acronym stands for. It's CITI though. It's the training everyone takes to do research.
Okay, and what is the standard that the federal government has with regards to research for children?
Well, it's a higher standard than for adults, but it really gets to human subjects protection. It's really described in the training in quite detail, but the main concept is you want to bring harm to children during research. The risk has to outweigh the benefit. What I do as a member of an institutional review board is make sure whoever's doing the study has considered all these things. And sometimes randomized controlled trials are allowed for other reasons. There's informed consent and other aspects of it. But we have to make sure that the human subjects are protected. And sometimes studies are modified to accommodate whatever an IRB says would be a better way of doing a study.
Isn't it true, doctor, that there's 4 different types of categories that IRBs are supposed to consider with regard to children?
Yes. I don't know if they are off the top of my head.
You don't know what they are?
Not off the top of my head, I really don't recall every detail. When I'm on an IRB, I usually have material in front of me.
Well, you testified very concretely that under no circumstances would an IRB approve a randomized controlled trial of children in masking. You were very confident about that.
I am. I still am.
But you still don't, but you can't tell us what the 4 levels of review that an IRB is supposed to use to determine whether or not such a study would be appropriate.
No, I don't know those off the top of my head, but I don't need to know them to tell you it's unethical. It's still unethical.
Okay. Well, let's say the first standard, these are in the federal regulation. Did you know that?
I did know that. Like I said, I don't remember all this stuff off the top of my head. I actually don't remember a lot of things. I know where to find things, and that's where I keep details. So I don't have everything stored in my head.
So one of the standards is research not involving greater than minimal risk to children. That's one of the standards, right?
Yes?
Okay. There's another standard, research involving greater than minimal risk, but presenting the prospect of direct benefit to the individual child subjects involved in research. Right?
Yes?
So greater than minimal risk, but the child may benefit. So there's a sliding scale, right, Doc?
Yes?
So to say unequivocally, if there's more than minimal risk to a child, you would under no circumstances allow a randomized controlled trial study. That's not true, because under the federal regulations, you can consider greater than minimal risk.
Mr. Shirley, can you reword your question? It got a little complex.
Doctor, when you testify that under no circumstances should a randomized controlled trial study be done with children wearing masks, because it presented too great a risk to them, correct?
I did.
Okay. But under the federal regulations, even if it's a greater than minimal risk, you can't do a study with children if it presents a prospect of a direct benefit to the children.
Yeah, that you may say that, but I think that actually highlights the point why I wouldn't allow a study to be done exposing children wearing masks. Because in my opinion, if you put children in one classroom that aren't wearing masks, or one school where they're not wearing masks, no matter how you design your study, you're still putting a population of children at risk where there really doesn't need to be. Because in my opinion, there's ample observational studies, national expert opinion, federal agency reports that say masks are safe and effective. So I couldn't advocate for any risk to be accepted by a child. Keep in mind, in a classroom in school, you have some children who have highly complex medical problems, greater risk. It just would be too complicated a study to design. You need to be large numbers. Yeah, so it's unethical. I stay with my position on that.
The regulations go on. The next one is research involving greater than minimal risk and no prospect of direct benefit to the individual child, but likely to yield generalized knowledge about the subject's disorder or condition. You familiar with that standard?
Yes.
You still don't think a randomized controlled trial of children wearing masks would be likely to yield generalized knowledge about children's disorders or conditions?
Right, I still don't think it's ethical. You have plenty of observational studies, like I just said, national experts, federal agencies who are saying masks are safe and effective. There's plenty of observational studies. So an observational study can answer the question, and in my opinion, has answered the question. So I couldn't put any child at risk in a situation like this.
Doctor, you heard Dr. Boston testify that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of studies, correct?
I did hear him testify that.
And you agree with that, right?
Yes, if you can do them, they're great.
And the reason they're better than observational studies is because observational studies suffer deficiencies.
Well, they are better than observational studies, but you can have problems with randomized controlled trials too.
The problems with observational studies are things like recall bias, other issues with observational studies, right?
Well, confounding variables. Confounding is the most common problem you have. But that's one of those things where when people do observational studies, they always list the limitations of their study.
Oh, well, we'll get into that, though.
Okay.
But again, I'm asking you about your opinion with regard to the unethical basis of doing randomized control trials with regard to student masking. So you don't agree with that statement. How about this statement? Research that the IRB believes does not meet the conditions of the previous three, but finds that research presents a reasonable opportunity to further the understanding, prevention, or alleviation of a serious problem affecting the health and welfare of children. Couldn't the randomized control trial of student masking fit that definition?
See, I'm going to keep giving you the same answer because you're asking me the same question. In my opinion, randomized controlled trials on children are unethical. And I've already answered it 3 or 4 times now.
I'm going to present the witness with what I asked in March next, I think it's the 13th.
Yes, counsel.
Plaintiffs 32. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry.
Doctor,
Mr. Fisher, before you go on, you were quoting a federal regulation, and this may be in my hand, but I just wanted to get the citation for the federal regulation that you were reading from before.
sure,
Is it this?
yes, it's included in this document, it's 45 CFR 46.404, .405, .406, and .407.
Thank you.
And it's contained in this document.
Thank you.
Unless there's an objection, I'd like to move this as a full exhibit, as a government document.
Just one moment, just a moment. No objection, Your Honor.
32 is full.
Thank you.
Plaintiffs 32 full.
That's what Dr. Yogi said. Comment on.
I can mark it out.
Doctor, I think I've already asked you to testify that you were on the IRB at the Rhode Island Department of Health, correct?
Yes,
Who else is on that board with you?
there's several other members, I'm not going to name one, but I can say one is Dr. Louis Marchetti, Dr. John Fulton, or two other members that come to mind. There's probably 8 other members. One of them would be Bruce McIntyre. Colleen Fontana is a member. I don't remember the other 4 or 5 members off the top of my head.
Well, the chairman is Louis Marchetti, correct?
Yes.
And he's a physician?
No, he's a PhD.
He's a PhD. And then there's a Jola Yemi, there's no way to pronounce this. Hamid Gio, do you know who that is?
I'm not sure who you're referring to.
One-
There's possibly new members that I'm unaware of. If you bring the form to me, I'll look at it, see if I can recognize the name.
Has this to be marked as page 33?
I'll take the judge's copy. Wait a minute, the one I need.
Sorry, Doctor, the pages are not numbered, but if you go towards the back, go the last 5 or 6 pages, it lists the IR, DOH, IRB members. I think it's 6 pages from the bottom. You see that?
I do.
Okay. You're listed there, third, correct, on the full board members?
Yes?
Okay, and those are the rest of the members, right?
Yes?
So you're not the board, you don't make the final decision, you're one of a team,
That's right.
right? So these other individuals, they have a different opinion than you. About the testing.
I can't testify to their opinion.
You don't know what their opinion is.
No, I haven't asked them any questions about this.
Has the IRB, has your IRB, Department of Health, ever been presented with a proposal to conduct a randomized control trial for students math?
Not that I'm aware of.
Now, this document has a whole format for how such a proposal would be made, correct?
Right.
And this isn't just for children, this is for any student, correct?
That's right. Yeah, for anybody.
But there is research involving children. It's on page 4. Right? Or 5, sorry.
Yes, there's a section called Research Involving Children.
So again, your board allows for research involving children, correct?
Sure.
Again, it's subject to the federal regulations.
Right.
Move that.
No objection.
33 is
Great call.
Now, Doctor, you heard Dr. Boston testify that there were 13 negative randomized controlled trials of community masking of adults between 2008 and 2021, correct?
I did hear that.
So there was no problem with the potential unethicalness of having adults being in this randomized controlled trial with draft masks, correct?
I don't know that for sure. I didn't review the studies, and I wasn't part of approving those studies, so I can't speak to how the studies were designed or what they did. I'm not familiar with those studies.
Okay. You familiar with the study in Guinea-Bissau?
I'm sorry.
Dr. Boston testified to a masking study being done right now in the country of Guinea-Bissau in West Africa.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
You know?
Could you be kind enough to spell that name?
The country name is GUINEA dash BISSA.
Thank you.
Just a moment.
With the attorney's approach, we can talk about the schedule. If this is a good time, Mr. Shirley.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
So the court's going to be in recess for an hour. We'll check them back. Closer to 1:40, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is